You start to question yourself, not because you've changed, but because the version of you that shows up around him barely recognizes the woman you used to be. You watch your words, walk on eggshells, and wonder if maybe you're too sensitive, too emotional, too much. But deep down, there's this quiet ache, because the man who vowed to love you makes you feel invisible unless he's the center of it all. He's charming in public, dismissive in private. He forgets what matters to you, but never what offends, and somehow you end up apologizing just to keep the peace. This isn't love, it's survival. And when you spend enough time surviving, you forget what it feels like to be safe. Not physically, emotionally, seen, heard, respected. That's what today's conversation is about. Not to shame, not to blame, but to bring light to the spaces where you've been dimming yourself just to make the relationship work. There are some conversations that are hard to have out loud, especially when the pain doesn't leave bruises, but it leaves you second, guessing your worth. Being married to someone who is deeply focused on themselves can feel like you're slowly disappearing in your own life. You stay quiet to avoid conflict. You carry the emotional weight of two people, and you start to believe that your needs are too much or your feelings are somehow wrong. That's not love, it's confusion wrapped in control. And what makes it harder is that from the outside, everything might look fine. But behind closed doors, you're shrinking to keep the peace. So today, I want to slow this down. I want to speak directly into that space where you've been silenced, not with judgment, not with anger, but with clarity, calm, and truth. Because when you're in something that chips away at your identity one moment at a time, it's hard to see it for what it really is. Let's look at that together. There's a certain kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being by yourself. It comes from being with someone who's supposed to know you, but doesn't. Who's supposed to see you, but won't. You can be sitting right next to your spouse on the couch, sharing the same space, the same room, the same life, and still feel completely alone. And when that becomes the pattern, you start to wonder if maybe it's just you. Maybe you're asking for too much. Maybe your expectations are too high. That's what emotional neglect does. It doesn't show up loud and chaotic. It shows up in quiet dismissals, in the way your voice gets tuned out, your feelings brushed aside, your presence taken for granted. In a narcissistic dynamic, this loneliness becomes chronic. You might find yourself constantly pouring into the relationship, caring, trying, adjusting, only to feel like none of it ever gets returned. You give empathy and don't get any back. You make room for their struggles, but there's no space for yours. And the hardest part, they might not even notice, because the spotlight is always pointed in one direction: their needs, their feelings, their version of the story. Over time, that imbalance trains you to keep everything in. You start shrinking what you say, editing how you feel, convincing yourself that silence is safer than being dismissed again. That's not a marriage. That's emotional isolation. And it chips away at your sense of self. You stop bringing things up not because there's nothing to say, but because you already know how it'll go. The conversation will be turned around on you. You'll be told you're overreacting, too emotional, too sensitive. Or worse, you'll be met with silence, that cold wall that says, you don't matter enough to respond to. And even though you try to be strong, even though you remind yourself to stay grounded, it still hurts. Because deep down, you're craving connection, not just physical presence, but emotional presence. Someone who leans in when you speak, someone who asks, not just tells, someone who sees you as a partner, not a prop. And here's what I need you to hear: that loneliness you feel. It's not because you're needy. It's because you've been emotionally starving. There's a difference. Human beings are wired for connection. We're not supposed to carry relationships alone. We're not supposed to feel unseen in our own homes. If you've been trying to hold everything together, giving grace where there's no growth, over-functioning to keep the peace, that's not weakness. That's survival. But survival shouldn't be the standard. Love without mutual care is not love. It's performance. And you weren't made to perform. You were made to be met, to be understood, to be in a relationship where both people are allowed to be human, to make mistakes, and to still matter. So if you're sitting in that kind of silence right now, wondering if what you feel is valid, it is. And no, you're not asking for too much. You're asking for what's fair. You're asking for what any healthy relationship should have: emotional safety, mutual respect, and the kind of love that makes you feel less alone, not more. There comes a point in a relationship where being the bigger person starts to feel less like maturity and more like a burden. It sounds noble: rise above, keep the peace, don't stoop to their level. And maybe for a while, that approach helps things move forward. You let things slide, you extend grace, you talk calmly even when you're being disrespected. But when you're always the one bending, always the one apologizing first, Always the one holding emotional space for two people. Something inside you starts to wear down. Not because you're weak, but because being strong all the time in a one-sided relationship isn't strength. It's quiet exhaustion. It's hard to admit that sometimes being the bigger person means you're carrying the weight of someone else's immaturity. You're the one who bites your tongue when they say something sharp. You're the one who tries to de-escalate when they shut down or lash out. You're the one doing the emotional labor to keep things from falling apart. And in a healthy relationship, that give and take would be mutual. But when you're with someone who rarely takes responsibility, who can't say, I was wrong or I hurt you, the pressure of always having to lead with grace turns into something heavy, something lonely. You start to notice how often your boundaries are brushed aside, how your feelings are minimized or intellectualized instead of honored. And every time you choose to be the bigger person, it feels a little less like maturity and a little more like silence, like giving up little pieces of your dignity to avoid yet another conflict you know won't be handled fairly. Over time, you find yourself shrinking, not to stay grounded, but to stay safe. And that's not love, that's survival disguised as peace. The truth is, there's a difference between being mature and being emotionally overworked. Maturity doesn't mean tolerating disrespect. It doesn't mean cleaning up someone else's emotional messes over and over while they stay comfortable in their patterns. Being the bigger person doesn't mean being the only person doing the work. At some point, grace without accountability turns into enabling, and love without accountability turns into imbalance. It teaches the other person they can keep falling short, and you'll keep carrying the weight. And I want to tell you, your back wasn't built for that. You deserve reciprocity. You deserve moments where someone sees the effort you've made and they meet you in it, where you don't always have to be the one to initiate the hard conversation or soften your tone just to be heard, where someone else leans in and says, you matter too. Because true partnership is not one person endlessly rising above while the other stays emotionally stagnant. It's both people growing, both people reflecting, both people apologizing when they get it wrong. So if you're tired, if your strength feels like silence, if being the bigger person has turned into losing yourself, it's okay to put that weight down. Not in bitterness, not in anger, but in clarity. Because the version of you who has always carried the load deserves to rest, deserves to be met halfway, deserves a love that doesn't make you earn peace, but builds it with you. Control doesn't always come in loud voices or slam doors. Sometimes it comes wrapped in concern, in phrases like, I just want what's best for you, or I know you better than you know yourself. It looks like checking your phone under the label of trust. It sounds like asking where you're going, who you're with, and how long you'll be gone, but not out of curiosity, out of quiet suspicion. And because it's dressed up as care, it becomes harder to see, harder to name, and even harder to challenge without being made to feel like you're the one who's ungrateful or difficult. That's how control hides inside the illusion of love. In relationships like this, love becomes conditional. You're loved when you agree. You're safe when you comply. You're respected when you don't push back. And so, without realizing it, you start shaping yourself around what they need. You adjust how you talk, how you dress, how you show up in the world, because keeping the peace starts to feel easier than being fully yourself. And they may never raise their voice or call you names, but they know how to make you second guess your decisions. How to twist your words just enough that you walk away questioning your own judgment. That's not guidance. That's manipulation. And no matter how gentle it looks, it's not love. Love doesn't need to control to feel safe. Real love lets you breathe. It respects your space, your voice, your choices, even when they're different. It doesn't keep score or demand you shrink to keep someone else comfortable. But when control is disguised as love, you start to internalize the message that your freedom is selfish, that your independence is disloyal. And that's when the confusion sets in. You may even hear yourself say, but they love me. They're just trying to help. And maybe they do love you in the only way they know how. But love without respect isn't love. It's possession. And I want to be real with you. It's hard to unlearn, especially when you've been told that loyalty means sacrificing yourself, especially when the controlling behavior started small, subtle. At first, it felt flattering, like someone was invested in every part of your life. But slowly, that attention turned into pressure, into guilt, into silence. And now you're not sure where you end and they begin. That's not love. That's fear pretending to protect you. You deserve the kind of love that trusts you to make your own choices. That doesn't need to monitor your every move to feel secure. That honors your voice, even when it says no. If someone can only love you on their terms, it's not your job to keep adapting. It's your job to get honest about how much of yourself you've been giving up in the name of peace. Because peace built on control isn't peace, it's captivity. And if this is striking a chord in you, know this: it's okay to want more. It's okay to name what's been happening. And it's okay to stop calling something love when it's been control all along. You're allowed to choose freedom over fear. You're allowed to belong to yourself again. There's a moment, maybe several, when you catch yourself apologizing again, and you're not even sure what for. You just know something felt off. The energy shifted, the tone changed, and your instinct was to smooth it over, to take the blame, to fix it before it turns into something bigger. And it's not because you're wrong, it's because over time you've learned that keeping the peace often requires you to carry the fault. That somehow you became the emotional glue holding the relationship together, and every crack, every misunderstanding, every tension feels like it's your job to mend. You say, "I'm sorry," not just when you've made a mistake, but when you're simply trying to express a need. You apologize when you cry, when you ask for clarity, when you stand up for yourself. You even apologize for how you feel like your emotions are an inconvenience. That's not kindness. That's conditioning. That's what happens when you've been in a dynamic where love feels like something you have to earn, where your worth is measured by how little trouble you cause, how flexible you can be, how quickly you can bounce back from being hurt. In relationships where one person holds the emotional power, the other often ends up doing all the bending. And at first, it may feel like compromise, like maturity. But when you're the one always saying sorry just to keep things calm, when your voice gets smaller so theirs can stay loud, what you're really doing is abandoning parts of yourself to stay connected. And that's a deep kind of loneliness, because even though you're showing up fully, it's never quite enough to satisfy them. The target keeps moving. You fix one issue and another appears. You meet one demand and suddenly there's a new one. Eventually, you start to wonder, what's wrong with me? You feel like you're always one wrong word away from being misunderstood, one bad mood away from being rejected. And the pressure to keep everything smooth becomes so heavy you forget what it feels like to just be unfiltered, unapologetic, real. That's not love. That's walking on emotional eggshells. And you weren't created to tiptoe your way through intimacy. The truth is, some people rely on you feeling less than to maintain their sense of control. They won't say it outright, but they'll imply it. Through sarcasm, through dismissive comments, through silence when you need support. They'll let you believe the conflict is always your fault, so they never have to reflect on their part. And here's where it gets hard. You've gotten so used to that role, you've started playing it even when no one's asking you to. That's what long-term emotional imbalance does. It becomes the story you carry even when it's no longer being written for you. But you can rewrite that story. You can start noticing every time you say, sorry, when what you really mean is, I have a right to feel this. You can honor the part of you that has tried so hard to be enough for someone who was never willing to meet you in the middle. And you can begin the slow, steady return to yourself. Because your worth isn't measured by how many apologies you make. It's measured by how deeply you live in your truth, even when it's not convenient for someone else. It doesn't happen all at once. The loss of your self-worth in a relationship is quiet, gradual. It doesn't come with sirens or warnings. It comes in the form of small, daily dismissals. A sigh when you speak, an eye roll when you share your feelings, a joke that cuts too deep followed by, you're too sensitive. And you brush it off at first because you don't want to overreact. You want to be the understanding one, the one who keeps things steady. But over time, you stop speaking up altogether. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you've learned that saying it doesn't lead to being heard. It just leads to being blamed. You start to question the way you see things. You used to trust your gut. You used to be clear about who you were, what mattered to you, what you deserved. But now you second guess yourself constantly. You replay conversations in your head, wondering if you were the problem. You apologize even when you're not sure what you did wrong. And that strong, grounded part of you that once knew how to draw a line, that part begins to fade. Because in a relationship where your feelings are minimized, your needs feel like a burden, and your value is only affirmed when you're pleasing someone else, you slowly forget how to belong to yourself. This kind of erosion doesn't look like emotional abuse on the outside. There are no shouting matches, no visible damage. But inside, it's a slow disconnection from your own voice, your own worth, your own center. And that disconnection gets masked as love. I'm just looking out for you. You always make things so dramatic. I didn't mean it like that. You're overthinking again. So you shrink a little more. You try a little harder. You carry the emotional weight for both of you and convince yourself that love means compromise, even when the only one compromising is you. And yet, deep down, something doesn't sit right. You feel it in your chest, in the way your shoulders stay tense, in how often you feel like you're not enough, no matter how much you give. You miss the version of you that felt confident, that didn't need constant approval, that didn't have to explain every boundary, every emotion, every decision. And you wonder where that person went. The truth is, they're still there. But they've been quieted by a dynamic that rewards silence over honesty, compliance over truth, self-abandonment over self-respect. And if you're in that place now, where love feels more like pressure than peace, more like performance than presence, I want you to hear this. Your worth never left you. It's just been buried under all the ways you've tried to make something work that wasn't built to hold you. You don't need to prove your value to someone who's committed to not seeing it. And you don't need to lose yourself to keep someone else comfortable. You can stop the erosion. You can choose yourself. And not in anger, not in retaliation, but in quiet, grounded dignity. Because reclaiming your worth doesn't mean you failed the relationship. It means you remembered who you are. There's a certain kind of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from fear. Not the loud, obvious kind of fear, but the quiet kind. The kind that whispers, if I bring this up, it's going to turn into a fight. So you swallow your truth. You soften your tone. You rehearse your words in your head, trying to make them sound less threatening, less emotional, less too much. And still, the moment you speak up about something small, something that matters, something that hurt, it feels like you've lit a match in a room full of gasoline. The air shifts, the temperature rises, and suddenly it's not about what you said. It's about how you said it, or how they feel attacked, or how now isn't the right time. Again, that's what happens when your voice is treated like a threat instead of a bridge. You learn that honesty costs you closeness, costs you connection, costs you calm. And when that happens enough times, you start doing the emotional math. You weigh the need to express yourself against the fallout that will come from doing it. And more often than not, silence starts to feel safer, not because it solves anything, but because it avoids another blow up, another shutdown, another stretch of cold distance you'll be the one to fix anyway. But here's the thing. When speaking up turns into a battle every time, you're not being partnered with. You're being managed, controlled, conditioned to believe that your truth is too disruptive, that your needs are too inconvenient. And so the relationship stops being a space for mutual growth and starts being a performance where one person gets to stay comfortable and the other carries the cost of that comfort. And it hurts because you're not trying to start a war. You're trying to be known. You're trying to bring your full self to the table. But when defensiveness is the default response and accountability is always redirected, it sends the message that only one person's reality is allowed to exist. That love only flows when you're easy. And if you're not easy, if you're hurt, frustrated, confused, or just human, that love gets withdrawn. That's not partnership. That's emotional punishment. You start to doubt your intentions. You think, maybe I could have said it better, or maybe I should have waited for a better time. And listen, self-awareness matters. But if you're always the one doing the adjusting while the other person refuses to meet you in the middle, that's not communication. That's imbalance. A healthy relationship doesn't fear feedback. It welcomes it even when it's uncomfortable. Because the goal isn't to win, it's to understand. So if speaking up feels like starting a war, that's not on you. That's a sign the relationship isn't safe enough yet for honesty to exist without punishment. And I want to tell you this as clearly and gently as I can. Your voice is not the problem. Your truth is not a weapon. And you deserve a relationship where being real doesn't cost you peace, but creates it. Where conflict is not a threat to love, but a path to deeper trust. You don't have to walk on eggshells to be worthy of respect. You already are. Emotional abandonment doesn't always look like someone walking out the door. Sometimes it's someone who stays in the room but leaves you alone in every way that counts. They're sitting next to you on the couch, across from you at dinner, lying beside you at night, but their heart, their presence, their attention, it's somewhere else. You bring something up that matters to you and it gets brushed off. You share a vulnerable moment and it gets met with silence. You cry and they look away, not because they can't hear you, but because they've chosen not to engage. And that kind of absence, the kind that shows up as cold, indifferent, emotionally unavailable, is one of the loneliest places to be. What makes it more painful is that you can't point to one big moment and say, that's when it happened. It's not one argument or one betrayal. It's the slow, quiet retreat of connection. The way conversations get shallow. The way affection becomes rare. The way you start to feel like a background character in your own relationship. You try to reach out, to reconnect, to ask for more. But the more you ask, the more distant they become. And somewhere along the way, you start to wonder if maybe you're just too needy. Maybe you're expecting too much. Maybe love is supposed to feel like this. Distant, cold, tolerable. But love isn't supposed to feel like you're invisible, like your presence is just tolerated, not cherished. And yet, in emotionally absent relationships, that's exactly how it plays out. One person carries the weight of emotional responsibility while the other stays disengaged. It's not always malicious. Sometimes it's unawareness. Sometimes it's emotional immaturity. But regardless of the reason, the impact is the same. You feel like you're loving someone who stopped showing up a long time ago. And it gets exhausting because no matter how many times you try to reopen the door, they don't walk through it. You bring your feelings to the table and they're met with defensiveness, dismissal, or discomfort. And over time, you stop bringing them all together. Not because you don't feel, but because it's too painful to keep feeling alone. That's what emotional abandonment does. It teaches you to shut down your own needs just to keep from being hurt by their absence again. If this is where you find yourself right now, I want you to know this isn't love's design. You're not supposed to have to beg to be heard. You're not supposed to feel like your emotions are a burden. In a healthy relationship, both people show up. Both people lean in. Both people create safety, not just with words, but with presence. And if someone has stopped showing up for you emotionally, you're not wrong for noticing. You're not dramatic for wanting more. Wanting to feel connected in your own relationship isn't a weakness. It's the core of what makes a relationship meaningful in the first place. You don't need a perfect partner, but you do deserve a present one. Someone who doesn't just share space with you, but shares heart, energy, and care. Because behind closed doors is where love should feel the most secure. And if it doesn't, you're not the problem. You're just finally seeing the truth you've been trying not to feel. There's a specific kind of pain that comes from knowing someone sees you and still chooses not to. When you're not just accidentally forgotten, but intentionally overlooked. And it's not always obvious from the outside. In fact, to everyone else, things may look fine. You might smile in pictures, show up together at family events, even have moments that feel normal. But underneath that surface is a quiet ache, the kind that builds when your presence is consistently dismissed, your contributions go unnoticed, and your needs are treated like background noise. This isn't about being unseen because someone's busy or distracted. This is about the moments when they know exactly what you need, what would make you feel valued, and they withhold it anyway. They know what kind of support would help. They know the effort it would take to show up, but instead they choose silence or distance or cold politeness that leaves you more isolated than if they weren't there at all. That's not love falling through the cracks. That's emotional neglect wearing a familiar face. And what makes it even harder is the gaslighting that often follows. When you finally speak up and say, I feel ignored, you're met with, you're too sensitive, or that's not what's happening, or I didn't mean it that way. Suddenly the conversation isn't about how you feel anymore. It's about defending why you shouldn't feel that way. So now not only are you hurting, you're also being made to feel irrational for hurting at all. That's a deep kind of dismissal, one that doesn't just overlook you, but asks you to overlook yourself. And over time, you start to question everything. You downplay your emotions. You talk yourself out of your needs. You start putting their comfort ahead of your clarity. You convince yourself that maybe you're just asking for too much. But let me tell you something, wanting to be seen, valued, and chosen, especially by the person you've built a life with, is not too much. It's the most human thing in the world. And if someone is repeatedly choosing to ignore your emotional presence, they are sending a message, whether they say it out loud or not. The pain of being overlooked on purpose is that it makes you doubt your worth in the place you should feel most secure. It's not about grand gestures or constant praise. It's about the small, intentional moments of acknowledgement that say, I see you. You matter to me. When those moments go missing, day after day, your heart starts to feel like it's disappearing. And yet you keep showing up, you keep trying, because part of you hopes that if you give just a little more, maybe this time they'll notice, maybe this time they'll meet you there. But love isn't a performance. You shouldn't have to earn basic emotional presence. If they only see you when you're bending over backwards, that's not connection, that's control. And you deserve more than that. You deserve to be chosen on purpose, not ignored on purpose. You deserve to be seen without having to raise your voice or lose yourself just to get their attention. You're not invisible. You're just in a space that's refused to look. Loving someone shouldn't feel like you're the only one rowing the boat. It shouldn't feel like you're constantly giving, constantly trying, constantly adjusting while they stay still. And yet, that's exactly what it turns into when love becomes a one-way street. You start the conversations. You repair the damage. You remember the important dates, the small details, the unspoken needs. You hold space for their bad days, their moods, their silence. And when it's your turn, when you need a hand, a word, a sign that you matter, you're met with distance or excuses, or worse, nothing at all. And you tell yourself it's okay. You make sense of it. They're just stressed. They're not good at expressing emotions. They love me in their own way. And maybe all of that holds some truth, but truth without balance becomes a burden. And slowly you start carrying the emotional weight for two people. You become the fixer, the peacemaker, the emotional anchor. You learn how to stay quiet when you're hurting just to keep things steady. You convince yourself that if you can just love them well enough, long enough, they'll finally start showing up the way you need. But real love doesn't require you to exhaust yourself into being worthy of it. When love is one-sided, it's not just about the absence of effort. It's about the erosion of your spirit. Because even when you don't say it out loud, you feel it. The imbalance, the emotional loneliness, the disconnect. And what hurts the most is knowing how deeply you care, how much of your heart you've given, only to feel like you're pouring into a cup that never pours back. It's not that you want perfection. You're not asking for constant attention or grand gestures. You're asking for presence, for partnership, for someone to meet you where you are, not just when it's convenient, but when it counts. And if you've been living in that space, loving hard, but receiving half of what you give, I want to say this gently, but clearly that's not sustainable. And it's not what love is supposed to look like. Love is a two-way exchange. It shows up, it listens, it adjusts, not perfectly, but willingly. When it's real, love doesn't let one person carry the emotional load while the other gets comfortable in passivity. Love isn't just felt, it's demonstrated. You deserve to be on a road that goes both ways, where effort is mutual, where emotional labor is shared, where you're not always wondering if you're asking for too much or giving too much. Because love that only takes and never gives, that's not love. It's imbalance dressed up in familiar clothes. You're allowed to expect more than scraps. You're allowed to want to be loved in a way that doesn't feel like work, like convincing, like reaching with no hand reaching back. And if no one said it to you yet, you don't have to prove your worth to someone who won't walk toward you. You are enough, not just in how you love others, but in how you deserve to be loved in return. It's not wrong to want love to feel like partnership. It's healthy. And it's time. There's a quiet kind of harm that doesn't leave bruises, doesn't raise its voice, and doesn't cause a scene, but it still cuts deep. It's the slow, steady damage that comes from being constantly criticized by the person who's supposed to love you the most. And at first, it might not even register as criticism. It might sound like advice, like concern, like helpful suggestions. Why do you always do it that way? You could have handled that better. You're just too emotional. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It doesn't erupt. It chips away, bit by bit, comment by comment, until one day you look in the mirror and you don't recognize the person staring back at you. Not because you've changed in ways you chose, but because you've been reshaped by someone else's disapproval. What makes this kind of criticism so damaging is that it gets into your head. It starts to sound like your own voice. You question every decision. You overthink every conversation. You doubt your instincts. You wonder if you're actually capable or if they were right. Maybe you really are the problem. And when the criticism is constant, even subtle, it becomes the emotional backdrop of your life. You don't even realize how much you've been bracing for it, how much of your day is spent anticipating the next judgment, the next passive comment, the next look of disappointment. This isn't about healthy feedback. In every relationship, we're going to rub up against each other's flaws. We're going to have moments where we hold up a mirror and say, hey, this isn't okay. But there's a difference between feedback that invites growth and criticism that shames. Feedback says, here's something I noticed, and I want to work through it with you. Criticism says, you're not enough, and you never quite will be. It's not about behavior. It's about identity. It doesn't correct what you did. It attacks who you are. And when that becomes the pattern, your relationship stops being a place of safety and starts becoming a place of performance. So what do? Most people start trying harder. You try to anticipate their moods. You keep the house cleaner. You manage your tone more carefully. You rehearse what you're going to say so it won't be misunderstood. You tell yourself, if I can just get this right, they'll finally see I'm trying. But the target always moves because the problem was never about your performance. It was about their need for control, their discomfort with vulnerability, their inability to sit with their own pain without projecting it onto you. And I want to speak directly to the part of you that's been carrying this weight, the part that's exhausted from trying to earn approval that never seems to come. You are not broken because someone keeps pointing out your flaws. You're not unlovable because you can't seem to meet their ever-changing standards. What you're experiencing is emotional erosion, where love is laced with judgment and connection feels conditional. And that is not your fault. If you grew up in a home where love was tied to performance, this might even feel familiar, safe in a twisted way. You might have learned early on that being good meant being agreeable, being accepted meant being quiet. That love had to be earned by walking on eggshells and keeping the peace. And so now, even in your adult relationships, you find yourself tolerating criticism as if it's normal, as if it's love, but it's not. Love builds, it encourages, it holds you accountable, yes, but not through shame, through compassion, through truth spoken in kindness, through a desire to grow together, not a need to stay superior. Love says, I see where you're struggling, and I'm here not to fix you, but to walk with you through it. Constant criticism says, you need to change so I can feel better about you. That's not partnership. That's emotional manipulation dressed up as concern. And here's what often goes unseen. When someone is constantly criticized, they don't just stop feeling safe. They stop being themselves. They stop dreaming out loud. They stop sharing their inner world. They shut down to survive. They hide their quirks, their preferences, their mistakes. Not because they want to be distant, but because being open has become too painful. And then the relationship suffers even more. Because now there's a wall between two people that didn't have to be there, built not out of bitterness, but out of self-protection. That's the silent damage. That's what people don't see. They don't see the spouse who doesn't talk much anymore, not because they've changed, but because they've been trained to expect judgment. They don't see the partner who keeps everything surface level because every deeper conversation has turned into an interrogation. They don't see the person who looks confident on the outside, but is crumbling on the inside, constantly wondering if today will be the day they finally measure up. And I want you to hear this in the clearest way possible. If you've been living under the weight of someone's constant criticism, you're allowed to call it what it is. You're allowed to say, this is not love. This is not support. This is not okay. You're allowed to stop bending yourself into someone else's idea of enough. Because the truth is, if someone only makes you feel valuable when you're perfect, that's not love. It's control. And love without freedom isn't love. It's fear in disguise. You have a right to grow in a relationship without being torn down. You have a right to speak without rehearsing every word. You have a right to feel safe emotionally, not just safe from yelling or cruelty, but safe from constant correction, from the feeling that who you are is always just a little too much or not quite enough. You don't have to prove your worth over and over to someone who refuses to see your heart. And you're not selfish for wanting to be accepted as a whole person, not a project to be fixed, but a soul to be loved. It's okay to set a boundary. It's okay to say, I love you, but this pattern is hurting me. And if they respond with defensiveness, with more criticism, with blame, that says more about where they are emotionally than it does about where you are. You can't fix someone's need to diminish others to feel secure, but you can protect your spirit. You can choose relationships where your light isn't constantly dimmed to make someone else feel comfortable. You can return to yourself, the version of you that knew how to breathe, how to speak, how to trust their own voice. Because that voice, it still matters. It's still there, even under all the layers of doubt and correction. And it's time to start listening to it again, to remember that the best love isn't loud or demanding. It's safe. It's the kind that leaves room for mistakes without making you feel like one. The kind that says, you're allowed to grow, but you're also enough right now. So if you've been living under criticism's shadow, know this, you're not crazy. You're not too sensitive, and you're not imagining the impact. And you're certainly not alone. Many people have learned to live quietly under that weight because they thought that's just how relationships work. But they don't have to. Real connection doesn't shame you into change. It invites you to be more fully yourself. That's the truth you can stand on. That's the truth you deserve.